So I'm going to be talking about the Crusades, the First Crusade, in fact, and why the Crusaders were actually sent and what really happened during the Crusade, that First Crusade. So the Crusades are not as cut and dry as many people have believed. They were started for multiple reasons, and those involved were not all barbaric. Crusade was started based on a desire for the protection of Constantinople, unity of the Western and Eastern churches under the Pope, atonement for the individuals, the expulsion of Islam from the Holy Land, and of course, financial gain. Despite the claims of unethical treatment from current historical reports, the Crusaders were truly going for religious redemption, and what atrocities took place were more of a sign of the time and less unethical justice. So the first thing that we're going to be looking at is what happened before the Crusades that kind of led up to it. And what we see is years and years before the First Crusade, there was a thing called the Great Schism. Basically, the Catholic Church was divided into an Eastern and Western. The Western Church under the Pope and the Eastern under the Holy Roman Emperor. And what happened was that the Pope under the Western Empire and the Catholic Church started to see that there's a lot of unrest and a lot of problems because local authorities were governing what would happen specifically with the churches there. And so the Pope started to create more reforms to create a little bit more control for the Catholic Church and take the control away from the local authorities. Unfortunately, when he started to create these reforms, he did not consult with the Holy Roman Emperor and the Eastern Church. And a lot of these reforms were actually counter to what they believed and kind of how they saw their doctrine. The Western Church was deeply embedded in Roman law, whereas the Eastern Church's theology took its roots from Greek philosophy instead. One of the really big things was the inclusion of the Holy Spirit as from the Father and the Son instead of separate. And so a lot of those things that Pope Leo IX did started to create a lot of problems. What further created strife was the relationship between Pope Leo IX and the Patriarch of Constantinople, Michael Cerularius. So there was, at this time, Norman Knights were invading southern Italy, and that area was controlled by Henry III, Pope Leo IX, and the Byzantine Emperor Constantine IX. And so they decided that since they all had property lining up in there, that they'd work together in this situation. Now, part of the agreement was that Pope Leo IX would regain control of the few Greek churches inside of Italy because it was mostly in his domain, instead of the Holy Roman Empire, which was over in modern-day Turkey. So to do this, he needed to get a synodical letter to show that he would be the new patriarch of these churches, which required that Cerularius would write this and send it to those Italian churches to say, hey, you're now under the control of Pope Leo IX. Unfortunately, he did not like this. He did not approve of that, and instead, he demanded that the Latin churches that were in Constantinople would reform to Greek rites and the stuff that they did in the Eastern Church. Furthering this, Cerularius persuaded some Western areas, including that in Bulgaria, to write a letter complaining about what Pope Leo IX had done and how heavy his hand was in that area. And so Pope Leo IX responded by sending off Cardinal Humbert to talk to the residents of Bulgaria. And basically, instead of just saying, hey, it's okay, we're going to work with you, he chided them and wanted to reassert the Roman claims over the Church of Bulgaria and really came down heavy on them, doing exactly what they had complained about, even though it may not have actually been the situation. Then what happened is in 1053, Pope Leo IX, while they're fighting off the Normans, was actually captured by Norman troops. And without the Pope, the rest of southern Italy, including the portion controlled by Byzantine, was threatened to be lost because he was the main force there. So Emperor Constantine IX persuaded Cerularius to send a consoling message to the Pope, basically saying, hey, we've got your back, it's going to be okay. And so Leo sent off diplomatic ministers, including Humbert, to Constantinople to create a better relationship between the East and West and kind of bridge that gap that started to happen there. But before the three ministers arrived, Leo actually died. And so Humper got there and wrote his own papal letter reminding Sir Hilarius, instead of trying to bridge that gap, that the Pope is the ultimate authority. He is in the lineage of Peter and should have complete control of the entire church, and that included what the Holy Roman Empire was in control of. So Sir Hilarius rejected that letter, was extremely insulted, and because of that, he believed that, with Pope Leo's death, that Humbert really had no jurisdiction, had no right to say anything to him, and basically kicked Humbert out. And Humbert, before leaving, went into the Hagia Sophia, the church that they had there, the main one, and actually excommunicated Sir Hilarius. And he, of course, in response, excommunicated all the papal ministers, and so they're creating this huge schism between the Eastern and Western churches. And since that time, the Western Church had been looking for a way to unite these churches again, but have it united again under the Pope instead of having those two unique Eastern and Western. And so what was great and what they thought was going to help was the rise of the Seljuk Turks, where they saw that this was their good opportunity to try and unite that under the sense that the Eastern Church was now going to need the Western Church's help again. So these Seljuk Turks were part of the Islam race, and basically the start of Islam was with a man named Muhammad. He created this religion called Islam, or submission to the will of God. And unlike Christianity, where Jesus rode in to Jerusalem on a donkey, showing that he was coming in peace, Muhammad was built on war and did go about trying to assert his rule over different areas that he was at. What he called this was jihad, or a holy war. Islam believed that there's two types of places. There were those that were already controlled by Islam, and there were places that were yet to be controlled by Islam and that were supposed to be controlled. And it was against these places, including those that had Christians in them, that they were supposed to wage this holy war and this jihad against them. So what was going on is that the Seljuk Turks were starting to move throughout the Middle East and starting to move up north, closer to Constantinople. And so Emperor Romanus IV in 1071 went to battle against the Seljuk Turks. Unfortunately, his army got completely wiped out, and what ended up happening is it created this vacuum behind where he had gone that led all the way up to Constantinople. And basically, the Seljuk Turks over the next year were able to take care of all of that region, going right up to the doorstep of Constantinople, to the point where the residents of Constantinople, if they stood on the walls, could actually see the Seljuk Turks outside of their walls. On top of this, the Turks to the east that's where they were, and the Pechnigs were up to the north, were advancing on Constantinople, and to the west, there's the Normans, who, after taking care of Pope Leo IX, they did get control of that southern Italy and had moved their way over towards Constantinople to continue on and destroying Byzantium. So in this situation, Constantinople was completely surrounded on all sides, and out of this despair rose the stronger emperor of Constantinople, Alexius I Comnenus. So he was able to purchase multiple mercenaries and protect his borders for just a little bit longer and hold off those three armies that were trying to take over Constantinople. So he'd finally gotten to a point where he needed more help, more so than just buying mercenaries. He needed help from the West, and in this moment, Pope Gregory VII saw his opportunity to unite these churches by sending off aid from the Western Church and basically making the Eastern Church owe them. So the land of Western Europe was spotted with unruly knights, multiple small kingdoms held constant raids against other smaller kingdoms, and it wasn't uncommon for these knights to even kill women and children. They'd fought against each other constantly, and Gregory saw that not only did the Eastern Church need help, but he could use that help to unite that Western area and all of these smaller kingdoms under the banner of the Church to go march out in defense of Constantinople. And so in that sense, he was helping out the East and hopefully making them owe the West, but also uniting the kingdoms and stopping all the raids and the killings that was happening within the Catholic realm. So he had been looking for that opportunity to unite the churches, and he saw this as an opportunity to unite it under his lead. So he started to put everything together to lead the knights himself to Constantinople. Because he was going to leave to lead them, he needed to put someone else in charge, and so he decided to leave the church in the control of Germany's Henry IV. Unfortunately, this relationship was quite brief, and Gregory started to speak out against the German appointments of the clergy, and Henry responded by calling for Gregory to be removed as pope. Due to this issue, obviously, with Henry calling out the Pope himself, they started to have some problems, and they needed to start to focus more on that than the threat over in Eastern Europe and Constantinople, and that basically halted any sort of progress they made. Fortunately, though, Gregory had laid all the foundation for Pope Urban II to actually create this crusade. So, with the cries of God wills it, or Deus vult, as was actually said, Pope Gregory VII in 1095 was able to unite Western Europe underneath the church to actually come out in defense of Constantinople. This time, however, instead of saying that we're just going to defend Constantinople, he said that his desire was now to reclaim the Holy Lands from the Muslims, who had created a very dangerous area for pilgrims to actually go back to Jerusalem to visit the area that Jesus walked in his gravesite, and then also to reclaim their own souls. He told them that if they did this crusade, that they would receive complete forgiveness of all their sins, and instead of having to purchase it as they had been doing, this would be their complete forgiveness right here. So, counter to what was popularly believed at that time, these were some of the reasons why people went. It really had less to do with financial reasons. Many of these guys who went had to sell everything that they had at extreme prices to go on these crusades. Robert, the Duke of Normandy, pawned all of the Duchy of Normandy to his brother King William of England, and to pay for the funds, King William had to raise taxes on England, which caused national outrage for him to do that. There's other stories of people selling everything with the understanding that they were more than likely going to die, and they would be martyrs for this, not just soldiers, but martyrs. So it had nothing to do with financial reasons. Now, there were those who obviously went for more financial reasons. Some of the underclass saw this as their opportunity to go receive wealth in that part of the world, but for the most part, these people weren't going for financial reasons. Now, the Crusades were led by four men: Robert, the Duke of Normandy, Beaumont, Prince of Tyrol, Raymond IV, and Godfrey of Bouillon. And they all start off with about 40,000 crusaders that met at Constantinople. It was about 50,000 less than it started, because there were small skirmishes along the way, people turning back, others dying, and finally getting there was that 40,000. So they thought that they'd get some help from Constantinople, but they actually got very little. The Constantinople army marched out only as far as they needed to get their land back and then turn back. The first city to fall was Nicaea. The Sultan didn't see that there was going to be much of a threat. He thought the Crusaders were going to be a small, unruly army, that he'd be able to take them out just with sheer force and the fact that he had more men. So he didn't really put much into it, and ended up Alexius was able to negotiate with the city after they had besieged it and allowed them to get all of the Muslims out safely and to put that city back under Alexius's rule instead of giving it over to the Crusaders, which kind of upset them, but they were able to move on and be fine. The second city to fall was Edessa. Baldwin and the cousin of Beaumont actually went away from the rest of the Crusaders and went to an area that was ruled by Islam, but was kind of their own area, and so they were kind of on their own. He had a great warm welcome everywhere they went, going into Armenia, which is where he ended up, and he met up with the king of Edessa, and this guy Thoros didn't really agree with everything that was going on with the Seljuk Turks and all of Islam, and so he actually put Baldwin as his second in command, his next successor. And what immediately happened, not because of that, but soon after that, Thoros was actually disposed of, and because of that, Baldwin took over and was able to make Edessa a stronghold of the Crusaders. Next city to fall was Antioch. They first spotted Antioch on October 21st, 1097, but decided to wait on besieging. Because they waited, though, they had to sit through a very harsh winter. And this is one of those times where they started to run out of food and resources. They're having to send people back to get food and bring it out. And there was those who actually started eating their horses and the camels and dogs that they saw. And even there's some reports that the Crusaders might have even started to resort to cannibalism. For the men who died, they'd actually eat them. What they didn't find out later on as well is that the Turks were actually sending reinforcements. Um, but what they didn't realize is that Bohemond, one of the generals, was actually working to corrupt one of the people inside the city to allow them into the city to take it over. And so what they ended up doing is before the reinforcements got there, they were able to get this guy corrupted. They scaled the wall. That guy opened up an area for them, and they were able to get inside the city, open up the gates, and get into Antioch to take it over. Once they were inside Antioch, then the reinforcements showed up. And again, they were laid siege, running out of food, and thought all hope was lost. But there was a man who called Peter Bartholomew, who said that there was the Holy Lance, the lance that pierced Jesus when he was on the cross. And even though many people had seen that in Constantinople is what they believed, Peter Bartholomew said that he had a vision, saying that it was actually buried in Antioch. And so they dug and dug, and finally he jumped in there after a few hours of them not finding it. He dug for a couple of minutes and pulled out a spearhead. A lot of people think that he probably planted it there, but nonetheless, it gave a lot of morale to the troops. So when they finally decided to march out against those reinforcements, they were really ready. Again, the reinforcements underestimated them. They expected most of these guys to be underfed, undernourished, many of them dying, ready to get out of there. So when they marched out, they weren't expecting for these men to just run out them, and they overpowered them. The Crusaders overpowered the reinforcements once again, and were able to completely take over Antioch. So the next place that they were on to was Jerusalem. They had multiple cities in between, but there was really nothing much there. Most of these cities were very easy to take over because they basically let them walk right in. And there was very little attack against them or defense. So once they got to Jerusalem, they were really blessed because they had only 15,000 Crusaders left, which wasn't very much, and they were heavily outmanned by Jerusalem. And they also found out that there was reinforcements coming from Egypt, but what they found was some Genoese mariners who happened to be there that had a bunch of timber and happened to be engineers as well. So they were able to use this timber to create some towers that they were able to then, when they attacked, which they had to attack immediately before the reinforcements, they were able to use these towers to get over the walls into Jerusalem and to actually take over Jerusalem because of this. And it is in this time that there's a lot of reports either saying that the Crusaders were really civil and allowed the inhabitants of Jerusalem to flee. Other stories claim that the city streets ran with blood all the way up to the knees and that the inhabitants were killed. The Crusaders acted with such brutality, and even some say that they ate some of the Muslims, and Muslims after this time called all Europeans cannibals because of this. More modern estimates are that around 3,000 to 5,000 people were killed in that battle, which is a little bit in between what was being said. In the end, though, the Crusades were quite a success. They were able to protect Constantinople, regain much of the land of Byzantium the empire had lost. It's also able to reclaim the Holy Lands and allow safer passage for the pilgrims. However, it did little to unite the Western and Eastern churches because of Constantinople not being of much help once it went through. There was some good that came from the Crusades. One of the great achievements was the foundation of healthcare, both for Christians and Muslims. There are multiple hospitals, not just in the First Crusade, but throughout the Crusades, that were built in Palestine and in the Middle East, and that were used to help a lot of people. Unfortunately, much of history on the Crusade is looked at as extremely negative. One of the authors that I read about says that if there's one thing that everybody knows about the Crusades, it is that they were a bad thing. He says that it was a really obvious thing that there's no way of really looking at it as good. He says, and even in the eyes of most Christians, let alone others, the Crusades were a crime against humanity, one for which apologies are due, especially to Muslims. There are others that say that the church preached hypocrisy in the midst of saying that, scriptures talk about peace and that we should be doing that, they instead sent people off to a holy war, and showed that the church was basically, since they were the only ones who could look at scripture and interpret scripture, were able to make it say whatever they wanted. Modern historians tend to compare the Crusades to modern values such as the Geneva Convention. We can't really do that, though, because at the time there weren't those sort of values placed on how we waged war. In fact, the Christians and the Muslims alike followed the same standards. If a city was surrendered before the attacking forces had stormed the walls, then the inhabitants would be safe and treated decently. And that's what both groups did. If, however, the attackers were forced to storm the wall, when they entered, they were free to kill and pillage and send a message to the towns that would be attacked later. And so it was really common. If you were forced to scale the walls, if you were forced to have your own men killed and attacked, that you would devastate the city. And so the further cities that you come into would hopefully surrender before you came there, and resulting in less bloodshed. As in most cases, perspective is key. So the First Crusade, as we can see, was started based on desire for the protection of Constantinople, unity of the Western and Eastern churches under the Pope, atonement for the people, and expulsion of Islam from the Holy Land, and obviously a little bit of financial gain. And again, despite the claims of unethical treatment from current historical reports, the Crusaders were truly going for religious redemption, and what atrocities took place were more of a sign of the time and less unethical injustice. So whatever people have to say, good or bad, which there is a lot of both, we must agree that it did change the world.